The sun was barely up, casting a soft golden hue over the sleepy streets of Jacksonville, Florida. A neighborhood that usually thrived on tranquility would soon be thrust into the violent spotlight of one of the city's most chilling crimes. On this day, however, the hum of routine life was abruptly shattered. The case? A Navy officer brutally murdered, her secret identity, one she had desperately tried to protect, unearthed in a way that no one saw coming. This is the True Crime Sketches file of Valerie Jacobson, a story of betrayal, deep-seated insecurity, and deadly confrontation. A tale where a new marriage and hidden past collided in a way that would change everything. Valerie Jacobson, at 29 years old, was known for her focus and dedication. Growing up in a small Ohio town, she dreamed big, and those dreams led her straight into the Navy right after high school. It wasn't just a job to her, it was her purpose, her identity. She thrived on discipline, finding a rhythm in military life that suited her perfectly. Her peers would often comment on her meticulous nature. Valerie was the kind of officer who ensured her uniform was flawless, her duties handled to the highest standard, and her superiors consistently satisfied. Work was her solace, her guiding star, until Tucker Jacobson entered her life. Tucker appeared out of nowhere, almost like a shadow weaving its way into Valerie's meticulously ordered world. They met through mutual friends in Jacksonville, and though their whirlwind romance lasted less than 6 months, it ended in marriage. It was sudden, too sudden, her friends would later say. The ceremony was small, intimate even, held at a quaint local chapel. Valerie smiled through the vows, but something lingered behind her eyes, a tension that those close to her couldn't quite put their finger on. Her friends noticed how she never spoke much about her family, always deflecting questions about her life before Tucker. Even Tucker himself seemed to know little about Valerie's past. She held her secrets close, too close perhaps. But then again, marriage changes things, or so it seemed at first. The days following their wedding weren't filled with the blissful glow one might expect. Valerie's friends noticed a subtle shift in her. She grew quieter, more withdrawn, as if the spark that once lit her up had started to dim. Tucker, while outwardly easygoing, had started to show another side, a side that was controlling, possessive even. Yet, Valerie pressed on, pouring herself into her career, dreaming of one day rising through the ranks to become a high-ranking officer. On the surface, she appeared unstoppable. But beneath the surface, a storm was brewing, a storm tied to a secret Valerie had carried for years. A secret that, if revealed, could unravel everything she had built. And then, in April of 2019, the storm came crashing down. April 18th, a Thursday morning like any other, until 7:30 a.m. That's when Jacksonville police received a frantic, breathless call. On the other end of the line was Tucker Jacobson. His voice shook as he tried to form coherent words. His wife, Valerie, she was dead, murdered. The police raced to the Jacobson home, a modest 2-bedroom house nestled on Lexington Drive, a street usually defined by its tree-lined serenity and decades-old families. When they arrived, Tucker was already outside, pacing like a man on the edge of sanity, his face pale, his eyes wide with shock. Inside, the scene was one of pure horror, blood everywhere. The master bedroom was a war zone of broken glass, scattered objects, and crimson streaks across the walls. Valerie's lifeless body lay near the bed, her eyes, her eyes, mutilated by what would later be confirmed as office scissors. Multiple stab wounds marred her once proud figure. A leather belt, darkened with sweat and violence, was still looped around her neck, evidence of a strangulation that had left her gasping for life in her final moments. The brutality of it shook even the most seasoned detectives. Detective Marcus Russ was first on the scene, a veteran of 15 years with the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office. Russ was known for his methodical nature, but even he found himself stunned by the sheer savagery of what had transpired. Beside him was Detective Lisa Henson, newer to the homicide division but already known for her razor-sharp instincts. Together they surveyed the scene, their minds already spinning with questions. Who could have done this? And why? Tucker sat on the steps, head in his hands, mumbling incoherently as the detectives began piecing together the puzzle. He claimed he had been out late with friends the night before, arriving home only that morning to find Valerie's body cold and lifeless. Neighbors would later corroborate part of his story, stating that they saw his car pull into the driveway around 7 a.m., but they heard nothing unusual. The night had been quiet, as it always was in this peaceful corner of Jacksonville. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear this was no random act of violence. This was personal. The kind of personal that leaves scars not only on the body but on the soul. Valerie had fought back, hard. The evidence was there in the blood stains, the overturned furniture, the desperate claw marks on the carpet. She had tried with every ounce of strength to survive, but in the end, it wasn't enough. What drove someone to commit such a heinous act? What had Valerie been hiding? And why did her secret have to end in bloodshed? As detectives delved deeper, they began uncovering the twisted truths that Valerie had worked so hard to keep buried. What they would find would not only shatter the lives of those involved but reveal a tangled web of deception that no one had anticipated. And so, this is where the story begins, of a woman who rose high only to fall hard, of a man consumed by control, and of a secret so dark that it ultimately led to murder. In the quiet streets of Jacksonville, beneath the veneer of normalcy, tragedy had struck, and it had left a mark that would never fade. The scene inside the Jacobson home was a macabre tableau of chaos. As Detective Russ and Henson moved cautiously through the bedroom, they couldn't help but note the palpable tension that seemed to hang in the air, even in the wake of death. The furniture was upended. A lamp had toppled from the bedside table, and the bed sheets were not just rumpled but shredded, torn as though in a frantic struggle. Blood, so much blood, had splattered across the walls, speckling the floor like a grotesque painting. And in the midst of it all lay Valerie Jacobson's body, her hands still clenched tightly in what appeared to be the final vestiges of her desperate fight for survival. It wasn't just the violence that struck the detectives, it was the precision. Valerie had been stabbed repeatedly with a pair of office scissors, the brutality of the attack most evident in her eyes, where the blade had struck with chilling intent. To make matters worse, a leather belt had been looped tightly around her neck, evidence that her attacker had resorted to strangulation. This was not the work of a detached killer. This was personal. The forensics team arrived swiftly, sweeping the room for clues as they sprayed luminol, revealing the ghostly traces of blood that had been hurriedly cleaned. Crime scene technicians dusted the scissors for fingerprints, examined the belt, and methodically worked through every inch of the crime scene. Outside, Tucker Jacobson continued to pace, his face pale and drawn, muttering questions to no one in particular. Detective Russ noticed his distress, but training dictated one thing: never trust appearances. The spouse is always a suspect, especially in cases like this. Detectives began piecing together the timeline of Valerie's final hours. The medical examiner determined that she had likely been killed between 10 p.m. Tucker, who claimed to have found her body just after 7 a.m., told the officers that he had been out with friends the night before, returning home late and crashing on the couch. But something didn't add up. As they worked through the evidence, Russ and Henson realized that there were no signs of forced entry. The front door was intact, the windows undisturbed. There was no indication of robbery. Valerie's phone and wallet were still in plain sight on the kitchen counter. Whoever had entered the house had likely been let in. This was someone Valerie knew, someone who had been close enough to gain access, and that made Tucker their prime suspect. Tucker Jacobson, 31, was a car salesman, a smooth talker with a laid-back attitude that had earned him a decent reputation at the Toyota dealership where he worked. Friends described him as easygoing, the type who got along with everyone. But there was another side to Tucker. Lately, his co-workers had noticed he seemed on edge, more stressed than usual. He wasn't his usual charming self. The stress? They weren't sure, but some suspected it had to do with his marriage. Valerie and Tucker had met in the fall of 2018 at a party thrown by mutual friends. It was a whirlwind romance. 6 months of dinners, walks on the beach, and whispered promises of forever that culminated in a small, intimate wedding. But behind the smiles and vows, cracks were already beginning to form. Valerie had always been careful. Too careful, some thought, about what she shared with Tucker. She never spoke much about her family, and she certainly hadn't introduced him to them. This, combined with her rocky relationship with his mother, Miriam, only fueled the growing tension in their marriage. Miriam was the next person detectives wanted to speak to. A woman in her late 50s, Miriam Jacobson had never warmed to Valerie. Behind her polite veneer was a bubbling cauldron of resentment, bitterness that stemmed from Valerie's refusal to play the part of the docile daughter-in-law. In fact, not long before the wedding, Miriam had made several inappropriate sexual advances toward Valerie, advances that Valerie had firmly rebuffed. The rejection had been a blow to Miriam's ego, and her resentment only grew deeper. To save face, Miriam began whispering vicious rumors, suggesting that Valerie was infertile, cold, and perhaps even hiding something dark from her past. As detectives pressed Tucker about his marriage, small cracks began to appear in his story. He insisted that he and Valerie had been arguing recently but shrugged it off as typical marital disagreements. Nothing serious, he claimed. But there was a pause, a hesitation, when the detectives asked if Valerie had been keeping secrets. Tucker's eyes flickered with something unspoken, but he quickly dismissed the notion. His words said one thing, but his body language suggested another. The detectives weren't buying it. Tucker's alibi, already shaky, began to fall apart under scrutiny. His friends confirmed that they had been at a local bar, the Garage, until about 9:30 p.m. Security footage showed him stopping at a gas station to buy cigarettes at 10:15 p.m., but after that, there was a glaring gap, an unaccounted-for window of time where Tucker's whereabouts were unknown. A window that coincided neatly with Valerie's estimated time of death. The interrogation continued, and Tucker's demeanor shifted. He had entered the room shaken, distraught, but as the questioning wore on, he became increasingly defensive. His hands fidgeted in his lap, his voice hardened. He denied knowing anything about Valerie's secrets, and he firmly stood by his story. But detectives knew better. They could sense the tension, the undercurrent of something deeper, something darker. Miriam, on the other hand, was a different story altogether. When she was brought in for questioning, she maintained her cool, speaking with the calm precision of someone who had nothing to hide. But beneath the surface, the detectives could see the cracks. She spoke of Valerie with an edge of disdain, hinting at the rift that had grown between them. She reiterated her belief that Valerie wasn't who she claimed to be, fueling the detectives' growing suspicions that the key to solving this murder might lie not in what was said, but in what was left unsaid. Valerie's secrets, whatever they were, had remained buried for years. But now, in death, those secrets were starting to surface, and with them came a wave of questions that would challenge everything the detectives thought they knew. The case of Valerie Jacobson had taken a dark and twisted turn, one that no one could have foreseen. As detectives Russ and Henson sifted through the tangled web of lies, betrayals, and hidden secrets, one thing became clear. This was far more than just a domestic dispute gone tragically wrong. The evidence that had surfaced painted a picture of desperation, drugs, and dangerous liaisons. Miriam Jacobson's whispers had spread like poison, slowly seeping into Tucker's mind. Her passive-aggressive remarks about Valerie, her cool demeanor, her distant behavior, had planted seeds of doubt in her son's heart. "She's hiding something," Miriam had told anyone who would listen. "There's something off about her." Miriam's suspicions weren't simply the ramblings of a bitter mother-in-law. There was venom in her words, the kind of venom that, once released, could corrode relationships from the inside out. The detective's investigation into Miriam had already raised more than a few eyebrows. But when an informant came forward with information linking her to Dean Vieri, a local drug dealer with a violent reputation, the case began to unravel in unexpected ways. Vieri wasn't just a small-time felon, he was a man with a reputation for ruthlessness. Miriam, it turned out, was deeply entangled in his world. Her addiction to painkillers, something she had hidden even from Tucker, had left her vulnerable to Vieri's predatory nature. The debts she had accumulated weren't just monetary, they were physical, transactional, and degrading. Miriam had been trading sexual favors to Vieri in exchange for drugs, and her situation had spiraled out of control by early 2019. Desperate to keep her addiction a secret, she withdrew large sums of money from her bank account, hoping to pay Vieri off. But as the investigators discovered, the payments hadn't been enough. The text messages between Miriam and Vieri painted a bleak picture of their relationship, one of coercion and threats. Vieri's messages had grown increasingly menacing in the days leading up to Valerie's murder. One message in particular, sent on April 14th, just days before the brutal killing, chilled the detectives to their core. "Time's running out, Miriam. You dried up old bleep." It was a threat, plain and simple, a promise of violence if Miriam didn't deliver. And then just days later, Valerie was dead. The discovery of Miriam's addiction, her mounting debts, and her involvement with a dangerous man like Vieri added an entirely new dimension to the case. Could it be that Miriam, in her desperation to keep her secret hidden, had somehow played a part in Valerie's death? Was it possible that Vieri had taken matters into his own hands when Miriam couldn't meet his demands? The investigators couldn't ignore the possibility. But things only grew more complicated when a massive crackdown on local drug dealers, spearheaded by Jacksonville police and federal agents, shifted the investigation once again. On April 19, 2019, just as detectives were closing in on new leads, they raided several properties as part of an operation to combat the rising opioid epidemic in the region. One of those properties belonged to none other than Dean Vieri. The raid uncovered a treasure trove of evidence, bags of pills, several unregistered firearms, and stacks of cash. But what stood out to the investigators working Valerie's murder was something far more personal. Hidden in Vieri's rundown apartment was an envelope stuffed with photographs of Miriam, Valerie, Tucker, and other family members. The pictures were accompanied by a series of sexually explicit text messages exchanged between Vieri and Miriam, messages that further cemented Miriam's involvement in his dangerous world. These discoveries left the investigators with more questions than answers. The connection between Miriam and Vieri was undeniable, but how did it tie into Valerie's murder? Did Miriam know her son's wife was in danger, or worse, had she been complicit in the crime, either directly or indirectly, to pay off her debts to Vieri? And what about Tucker? As detectives combed through the evidence, they couldn't ignore the possibility that his mother's manipulations, her toxic gossip, and her involvement with Vieri had warped his mind. Had Miriam's insinuations and her mounting pressure pushed him to a breaking point, leading him to snap and kill his wife in a moment of rage? Or had he been oblivious to the sinister forces at play, merely caught in the crossfire of a much larger scheme? As the investigation pressed on, it became clear that the truth wouldn't come easily. Valerie Jacobson's murder had spiraled into something far darker and more convoluted than anyone could have imagined. In the midst of all the lies, the betrayals, and the violence, one thing remained certain. Valerie's death wasn't just a senseless tragedy. It was the result of secrets buried so deep they had festered and rotted, poisoning everything they touched. True crime sketches solvers, what do you think? Could Miriam's desperation have led to her daughter-in-law's murder? Or was Vieri the true mastermind behind this horrific crime? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more real-life murder mysteries. And as always, stay safe, true crime sketches solvers. But this case, it wasn't over yet. The deeper the investigators dug, the more twisted the story became. And as the walls closed in around those involved, the truth, the real truth, would shock everyone. The revelations that emerged in the months following Valerie Jacobson's tragic death left a city reeling. What began as a seemingly straightforward murder case had now spiraled into a complex tapestry of secrets, betrayal, and raw, unchecked emotions. At the center of it all stood Miriam Jacobson, her toxic relationship with a violent drug dealer, and her own web of lies that slowly began to unravel. But perhaps the most shocking twist of all was Valerie's secret, one that she had kept so carefully, so fearfully hidden, until it came crashing down in the most tragic way possible. The messages between Miriam and Vieri made one thing clear. Miriam had not just been a victim of her own addiction, but had been deeply enmeshed in a coercive, dangerous relationship. Vieri was not a man to be crossed, and in his increasingly threatening messages, he all but commanded Miriam to handle her debts, or he would make her suffer in ways she couldn't imagine. His ominous threats and Miriam's desperation painted a grim picture, one that the detectives could no longer ignore. Detectives Russ and Henson now had to consider the possibility that Miriam, in her desperate bid to keep her debts and drug use hidden from her son, had been manipulated into taking drastic measures, perhaps even going as far as being involved in Valerie's murder. As they reeled in key witnesses once more, the questions began to mount. Tucker, who had fiercely defended his mother early on, was now visibly shaken as the walls of his reality began to crumble. His mother's involvement with Vieri, her addiction, her desperate and degrading exchanges, it was too much to process. Confronted with this new information, Tucker could barely speak, the weight of it suffocating. Was it possible that his mother, in her desperation, had played a part in his wife's death? Or worse, had she encouraged it? By late April 2019, the investigation had taken on a life of its own, revealing far more than anyone had expected. The public had originally seen Valerie as a dedicated Navy officer, someone with a seemingly perfect life and a promising career. But beneath that polished exterior was a woman living in fear. Fear that her past would come crashing down and destroy the life she had worked so hard to build. Valerie's secret was one she had kept for years. She was transgender. The military's policies on gender identity were murky at best, and Valerie knew that the revelation of her past could bring her career to an abrupt end. She had carefully hidden every trace of her transition, safeguarding the documents that could expose her, ensuring no one in her professional life knew the truth. But that secret, once safe, had suddenly become a ticking time bomb. In early April 2019, Tucker stumbled upon the very documents that Valerie had worked so hard to keep hidden. The discovery sent shockwaves through their marriage. The trust between them, fragile and untested, shattered in an instant. Tucker felt betrayed, felt as though Valerie had deceived him from the start. Friends would later recall that Valerie had been terrified of what this discovery would mean, not just for her marriage but for her entire life. She had confided in a few close friends that she feared Tucker would leave her, that he would reject her for keeping this part of herself hidden. And it wasn't just Tucker's rejection she feared, it was the loss of everything: her career, her reputation, her very identity. Valerie's anxiety grew with each passing day, and as tensions in their household mounted, she grew more and more withdrawn. The cracks in their relationship, once small and manageable, widened into deep fissures that couldn't be ignored. On the night of April 28, 2019, everything came to a head. A heated argument erupted between Valerie and Tucker. Their voices carried through the walls of their modest apartment in Jacksonville, Florida. Neighbors reported hearing shouting, fierce, angry shouting, and the sounds of things being smashed. Then, silence. Hours later, Valerie's body was found, a victim of a violent and fatal struggle. Tucker initially claimed that he had left the apartment that night, but surveillance footage placed him at the scene just before Valerie's death. And then there was the damning evidence on his computer. Searches related to violence and betrayal, searches that painted a chilling picture of a man driven to the brink by rage and a sense of betrayal. It wasn't just an impulsive act, it was premeditated. On May 1, 2019, Tucker Jacobson was arrested. He maintained his innocence, insisting that he loved Valerie and could never harm her. But the evidence against him continued to mount. As detectives pieced together the final moments of Valerie's life, they uncovered a heartbreaking truth. Valerie had lived in constant fear that her past would be revealed, and in the end, that very fear had led to her death. As the case drew national media attention, it also sparked a larger conversation about the challenges faced by transgender individuals, especially those in traditional conservative professions like the military. Valerie's death became more than just another tragic statistic. It became a symbol of the dangerous intersection of secrecy, identity, and fear. Her story resonated with countless others who struggled with acceptance, who feared the consequences of living their truth. In late October 2019, the trial of Tucker Jacobson began. The courtroom was packed, the atmosphere tense. Tucker, now 31, stood accused of murdering his wife, Navy officer Valerie Jacobson, after discovering she was transgender. The prosecution, led by Karen Laurie, a sharp, no-nonsense attorney with a reputation for being tough as nails, argued that Tucker's actions had been fueled by a toxic combination of rage, betrayal, and transphobia. The trial gripped the city of Jacksonville. People followed every twist and turn, every revelation that came to light. As witnesses took the stand and evidence was presented, the full extent of Valerie's fears and struggles came into focus. Tucker, once a seemingly loving husband, was now painted as a man who had let his anger consume him, a man who, in the face of his wife's most vulnerable truth, had turned to violence. And yet the shadows of Miriam and Vieri loomed large over the courtroom. As the trial unfolded, the question remained: had Miriam's toxic influence, her whispered doubts and vicious gossip, her dangerous entanglement with Vieri, somehow pushed her son toward the unthinkable? Had her own secrets indirectly set off the chain of events that led to Valerie's death? As the jury prepared to deliberate, the weight of the case hung heavy in the air. Valerie's death was more than just a crime. It was a reflection of the dark and tangled forces that can tear lives apart when secrets are kept too long and truths are buried too deep. As the courtroom drama unfolded, the stakes were clear. This wasn't just about one horrific night. It was about shattered trust, buried identities, and the tragic collision of two lives caught in the throes of unimaginable tension. Prosecutor Karen Laurie stood firm in her argument, her voice steady but impassioned as she addressed the jury. Valerie had hidden her transgender identity not out of deception but out of fear. Fear of losing everything she had worked for over her 8-year military career. Fear of losing the man she thought she loved. For Valerie, keeping her past hidden was a survival tactic in a world that had not always been kind to people like her. Laurie presented Tucker as a man who couldn't handle the truth, who lashed out when faced with the revelation of his wife's transition. The discovery of Valerie's medical records had ignited the explosive confrontation that ended in her death. It wasn't just the shock, Laurie argued. It was Tucker's inability to reconcile the woman he thought he knew with the reality of who she had been. In that moment of anger and betrayal, Tucker's actions turned deadly. On the other side of the courtroom, defense attorney Michael Reed worked tirelessly to reshape the narrative. He portrayed Tucker as a man overwhelmed, a man caught in a storm of emotions that he simply couldn't navigate. The defense wasn't denying that Tucker had killed Valerie, but they argued it wasn't premeditated. Reed urged the jury to consider the overwhelming shock and emotional turmoil Tucker faced, upon discovering his wife's secret. He described the murder as a heat-of-the-moment reaction, not driven by hatred or malice, but by confusion and hurt. Reed implored the jury to grant leniency, suggesting that Tucker was already living in a personal hell after losing Valerie, and that his entire future shouldn't be defined by one tragic night. Throughout the trial, Valerie's family remained a constant, heartbreaking presence. Seated in the courtroom, they sat quietly, their faces etched with grief. Not only had they lost a daughter, but their loss had been laid bare for the world to see. Valerie's most intimate truths exposed, dissected, and broadcasted. The trial was more than just a fight for justice. It had become a public spectacle, with media outlets seizing every detail, every revelation. Valerie's transition, her fears about her identity, and the dangers she faced in both her professional and personal life became front-page news. The case reignited discussions around the treatment of transgender individuals in the military and the lethal consequences of transphobia in intimate relationships. In November 2019, the jury returned its verdict, guilty of second-degree murder. Tucker was sentenced to 30 years in prison. For some, it was a fair outcome, a recognition that Tucker had taken a life in a violent and brutal act. But for Valerie's loved ones, no sentence could truly feel like justice for a life lost too soon. Valerie's death was a wound that wouldn't heal with time. It was a symbol of the ongoing struggles faced by the LGBTQ+ community, a reminder of the dangers that came with living authentically in a world that didn't always offer acceptance. After the trial concluded, Tucker began serving his 30-year sentence at a Florida state prison. His time behind bars was marked by silence, particularly when it came to the events that led up to Valerie's death. Reports suggested that Tucker struggled with guilt and remorse, but there remained speculation as to whether he had ever fully accepted Valerie for who she was. The debates surrounding the case continued to ripple through the public consciousness, touching on the intersections of transphobia, domestic violence, and the complexities of the justice system. Meanwhile, Tucker's mother, Valerie Jacobson, faced her own unraveling. Investigators had unearthed a disturbing pattern of behavior that extended far beyond mere gossip. Miriam had been spreading malicious rumors about Valerie well before the murder, stoking tensions with her son and others. The fact that Miriam had made inappropriate sexual advances toward Valerie and had been rebuffed only added fuel to her resentment. This rejection, combined with her struggles with addiction and financial ruin, created a toxic stew of emotions that poisoned her relationship with her daughter-in-law. By the time Valerie was murdered, Miriam had descended into a dangerous spiral of addiction and debt. Her involvement with Dean Vieri, a notorious local drug dealer, was more than just a financial transaction. It had become a dark, tangled web of exploitation and manipulation. Miriam had sold herself to pay off her growing debts, trapped in a world where her addiction held her captive. Once seen as a respected figure in the Jacksonville community, Miriam's reputation was now in tatters. In mid-2019, Miriam faced her own set of charges: drug possession and solicitation. Her once tidy life unraveled completely as the extent of her involvement with Vieri and the local drug scene came to light. She was sentenced to 2 years in prison, a far cry from the life of control and respect she had once projected. For many, Miriam's downfall was both tragic and deserved, a stark reminder of how secrets, jealousy, and addiction could lead a person down a dark and destructive path. As for Vieri, the man who had preyed on Miriam's vulnerabilities, his time as a kingpin in Jacksonville's drug world came to an abrupt end. The investigation into Valerie's murder had blown open his network, exposing his operations and leading to his arrest. During a July 2019 drug bust, law enforcement found him holed up in a rundown apartment, surrounded by bags of pills, firearms, and stacks of cash. But what sealed his fate were the charges of human exploitation, preying on women like Miriam, exploiting their addictions for his own gain. Baser was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison, his drug empire dismantled by authorities who finally put an end to his reign of terror over vulnerable women in the city. The aftermath of Valerie Jacobson's murder left scars across Jacksonville, both visible and invisible. Families were torn apart, reputations destroyed, and lives were irrevocably changed. Yet in the face of such darkness, Valerie's story also sparked a movement, one that called for greater awareness, understanding, and protection for transgender individuals in the military and beyond. As the city grappled with the loss of one of its own, the memory of Valerie's courage, her dedication to her country, and the tragic end to her life became a rallying cry for a world that could no longer afford to turn its back on those living their truth.